Welcome, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining this knowledge sharing session, which we are co-organizing in partnership with UNESCO Future Literacy Lab team, which is represented here by Riel Miller and Eva Feukeu and Clara Rem. In the last 18 months, we've been going through interesting developments and challenges. And the question around how do we get ready to face the present and the future has been coming more and more on our daily agenda, at least in the work that we've been doing at the Technology and Innovation Lab. We have been exploring with different foresight and scenario planning approaches in trying to better understand the impact of emerging technologies on development. We are not the only one doing that. We've been engaging with our colleagues at IMF and at UNESCO Future Literacy Lab to learn from each other and to build on each other's knowledge in this space. And today, Riel and his colleagues are going to share with us a little bit more about how do we use the future to promote development and why we need to use more future and foresight approaches in order to engage in a more systematic conversation about the role that multilateral organizations have to play in shaping the development, but also helping our partners in their development priorities and initiatives. Our colleagues at UNESCO have been training policymakers, humanitarian organizations, and other stakeholders groups on how to use future approaches in their work. They have produced a lot of knowledge briefs around their experience in this space, which they're going to share with us today. We will take the next 40 to 45 minutes to go through a series of presentations from Riel and his colleagues, after which we will use the rest of the time to ask questions, share our experience, our learnings from adopting foresight and future methodologies in our work. And we'll see how we can continue this collaboration moving forward. Thank you everyone for joining. Post your questions in the chat. And heading it over to Riel. Riel, over.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be able to join with all of you and to have this conversation and to share some of the experiences that we've had around the world. I want to salute the who's here, but I think we have a little introductory game to play, a kind of a warm up, conscious of the virtual. The bandwidth the virtual world does not have, and having gone back, so just so you know, I was actually yesterday in my first big lecture hall. There were actually, it was a lecture hall for about 800 people, and they had 350 people in the lecture hall. It felt like a massive crowd. It was like, I thought, oh my God, I haven't seen this many people all at once. But everybody was masked and everybody was tested and controlled at the door and all the rest. But the physical is coming back to a certain extent, but here we are in the virtual, which I think also has huge benefits, above all in terms of access and our ability to connect with each other. But of course, it does mean that we have to pay attention to the fact that we're in the virtual world where the bandwidth is not as strong, and it takes more for us to understand each other and connect. So we're going to do a little, I think, warm up, Eva. If I turn it over to you so we can go around the whole group.
Sure. I would suggest, actually, we had two propositions initially. We're kind of wondering which one to run you through. I propose actually that we do both, but I'll first start with the easy one. Since we are talking about economic prosperity and development, what I propose to throw at you is what we call a word association game. So I will start with one word, and I'd like for all of you, so just going one by one, I can just name you directly, for you to actually share a word that you think is associated with this idea, and explain what the other one is. So right away, putting us back in gallery mode, I'm actually going to say economic prosperity, and I'm throwing the ball to the next person on my screen, who would be Sandile.
Hope is my word.
Noted. And so we were bounced on the next one. The next one I have on my screen is Riel.
It'd have to be emergence.
Of course. Then right after you is Alexander Sokolov.
It's science and innovation, I would say, a couple of words.
Science and innovation. I have Vicky right after you.
Happiness.
Thank you, Vicky. Christine, and then Stella.
Fun.
Oh, Stella.
Inclusiveness.
Katarina? Katarina Krepas. I don't know if she can see us. Katarina once, Katarina twice. If you're speaking, you're on mute, just so you know. Katarina 3 times, then moving to Benedicta Roland.
Social banking and social finance.
Noted. With social banking and social social finance, we have Colleen.
Equalities.
Noted. Then I have Patrick Chang, and then Clara just after. Clara.
I think developments. I think with development mindset. Yeah.
Development mindset. Clara, over to you. Clara M. You're on mute.
Difficult. Everybody's had so many already. Probably inclusiveness and currently health.
And then I have Mora Farad and Prema Chandru.
Technology.
Thanks, Mora. Prema.
Hi, I am with the World Bank ITS Technology and Innovation Lab. I work with Stella and the entire team together.
Thanks, Prema. Can you just give us a word that you think resonate with technology just before?
I think technology is a necessary, I see that as a necessary facet for inclusivity.
So you would connect technology with inclusivity, just, okay, so we have inclusivity coming again. I have Or Halsema just afterwards.
Nothing new here. I like inclusion. Thank you.
Noted. Inclusion comes again. Alexandra.
I would say development.
Development. Thank you. Hamed Honari and then Monika Kowalski-Skowski.
Technology and development.
Technology and development. Monika?
Democracy.
Democracy, thank you. Then I have Kirpal Shahon.
Just opportunity.
Opportunity, thank you. I have Klaus Tilmes and then David. Yeah.
Agency.
Agency. Thank you. And then I have Avril David and Christina Gaginski.
Yes, I'd say a quality of life.
Thank you. Quality of life. Noted. And great equalizer is coming in the chat as well. And then Christina Gaginski.
Thank you. I apologize. I have just joined due to some technology issues. I did not catch up the question. Please excuse me.
Noted. Christina, basically we're going for a word association game. So the idea is to just connect the word that you hear before you with, basically give us a word that resonates with that word that you heard. So the last one we heard was on quality of life. So what would be one word that you associate with that word?
Happiness.
Happiness. Noted. It's funny how we do get, words that come around and that you associate with one another. So there was this idea of inclusiveness and inclusion that were very much related to technology. So how the tool that we use can actually service a certain type of purpose that we actually intend. Now, what we mean by inclusion or inclusivity or inclusiveness might be different from one another. And that's also one of the elements that we'll discuss, because there's a question of both the intent, so what we call the axiology, and also obviously the methodology. How do we achieve it? And so those elements will be core and key to that conversation. We are many on this call, so I don't know to what extent we can actually go for a quick round of self-introduction. I would suggest maybe that we do that directly in the chat. So if anyone can actually just briefly just explain, just your name is obviously already written, but if we can get like your title, the organization that you're coming from, feel free also to rename yourself to indicate that on the call. That would be also mostly helpful. Yes, thank you, Riel, for getting us rolling. I'll do the same. I guess that allow me to throw the ball once again back to you, Riel. What I would propose, and that was the second activity that we had in mind, is to also run you through the type of things that we do daily. So for now, you don't know exactly what we do, not even what we do daily. And so, but one of the things that we do is to run what we call futures literacy experiments. And we do that with many people all around the world. And the way we start most of those activities is actually by talking about the futures that we know. So talking about, for example, probable futures of a theme that we care about. So I actually wanted to ask all of you, as you're writing in the chat as well, to take just literally just 1 minute. So there will be this 1 minute of silence on a Zoom conversation. And so please do anticipate that. To just literally close your eyes. And to lead by example, I'll do the same. You're jumping to 2050. So another 30-year span, we're talking about time traveling here, which means that when you open your eyes, which is not now, but when you do, you are in 2050. But a particular type of 2050, it's a probable 2050, meaning that based on trends, on scenarios that you've heard about, it could be the CIA report for 2050, who knows, you believe that this 2050 would happen. You can bet on it. And this is the 2050 of probable future of development and economic prosperity. What does it look like? How do people actually share value? How do they create value on a daily basis? How do they communicate? Here, you're talking about your specific location. So it can actually be where you're currently located just before time traveling, or you choose another location in the world. Please speak about what's happening in that setting. So we just have just 1 minute. We just type in the chat, and we'll speak to that later on. You'll understand why we asked you to do that to begin with. But please do take that 1 minute to just write in the chat. And right now I'm pausing to allow you to have that time. I'll give us 10 more seconds. Please hit the send button. It can be just a short sentence, that is okay. You could spend an entire exercise just doing that, as you know. But this just to give you kind of a glimpse of what we're going to discuss for the next hour. Thank you for those to those who already shared some of that in the chat. I see more coming. So we hear about the struggle to actually spread the benefits of technology in equitable ways. So this notion of equity and technology that comes back. The question maybe that I have for that comment would be also when we talk about sharing the benefits of technology in equitable ways, then what is the main focus? Is it the equity to begin with, or is it actually technology and what it has to bring? There's outer space, real estate, travel, and arbitration has become a way for people to escape the challenging and unresolved issue of climate change. Probable future in Paris, zero cars, no offices, a learning city for people who want to join together to explore the history of the city. You can only enter Paris if you're willing to stay for at least 2 months. You have to share in communal tasks 3 hours a day, 4 days a week. You'll be expected to perform something after 2 months in order to leave or to stay. We see things around community-based self-organization, new connections between rural and urban areas. I'm actually thinking as I'm reading through, Riel, do you want to ask a few people actually what they've actually shared just before you start your own presentation?
Sorry, yeah, I think we can read through them online. I think it's a good segue into what I was going to start talking about, which is in the last few weeks we've run quite a few futures literacy labs, and one of them, just to take one example, was a 3-day lab involving 70 students in Saudi Arabia, about 50-50 male female, divided into 2 parts of the room, and there was a very large number of students whose probable futures and also their desirable futures had to do with space travel and escaping the Earth and escaping its pollution. And I was struck by how that image has become, kind of ubiquitous in the last little while. The other thing that recently struck me in a discussion around people's probable images of the future was the Terminator, the idea of the ability to read read consciousness, and in fact upload and download consciousness, which again is a science fiction trope that's not a new one, but again how it inhabits people's thinking, and it's one of the fascinating aspects of asking people, like we've just done, to share just off the top of their heads, just the way, without really worrying or thinking about it too deeply, just what comes to our minds. And this is the entry point, in a sense, for participation that pays attention to the specifications of participation. So let me roll it back a little bit. I ran my first large futures exercise in 1988. I'd been at the OECD already for in 82, 83, 84, PhD in economics, and I was asked to run a 2-year process thinking about the future of higher education in Ontario. And so one of the things that immediately became apparent was that people who were essentially, from my point of view, using a model to think about the future. So we were doing this, Canada, participatory policy formation is kind of long-standing practice in the policy-making field in Canada for a variety of reasons. I think probably most of you understand why, binational, federal, etc. And so, dropping a policy down from on high doesn't really work. So you want to build up its credibility and legitimacy and its specificity on the basis of consultation and participation. So that's where I was kind of situated when I was asked to get people to think about the future of post-secondary. And it was, I was worried, I have to say, at the time. I was worried by the idea that people wouldn't be talking about the same thing, that they would be talking across each other, and that they'd, and I also was worried that our imagination wouldn't be particularly, let's call it, fertile or strong, meaning exercised. And it turned out that those worries were well justified, because despite the fact that we were given the time to consult and to participate, and participation was solicited in a very organized fashion. They're using the trade unions that are present in the post-secondary system for graduate students, for professors, working with the parents for the students, and working with students groups and the student organizations, and obviously administrative organizations. The vast majority of the ideas of the future were very mundane, very familiar, and not even particularly satisfying for the people who produce them. Um, and so, coming out of the OECD experience, where we were doing obviously forecasting, and I was, of course, trained to think about the robustness of the models, and the theory behind the specifications, and the reasons to tweak the models. Um, the question became, how can we ensure that people, when they start to talk about the future, actually have a similar idea of what they mean by the future, and also that they're dealing with the same kind of concepts. I really recall the SDG consultation, the Sustainable Development Goals consultation, which was very impressive, because I can't remember the exact figure, but it was in the tens of thousands, I think, of people who participated online. But when you look at kind of what people were inputting, it was apples and oranges, and frogs and meteorites. It was it was such a mixed bag of things that, of course, you could pick and select and try and find patterns, but really, it didn't add up to much that was, I think, genuinely reflective of people's imaginations. But also, it was once again a confirmation that our imagination is not something that we have practiced, cultivated. So the little exercise we did in the chat, the reference that Eva made to Futures Literacy Laboratories, all of this is part of what I would call really an attempt to move, and I'll use the big word, scientific foundations for thinking about the future, not because the future can be studied scientifically, because it can't. The future doesn't exist, so you can't study it. There's no evidence or data from the future. But what we can study, and being, I think, quite systematic and rigorous about, are the anticipatory systems and processes that people use when they imagine the future, and the implications of different reasons and different kinds of scenarios, images of the future, for what people see, perception, and then what people do, choice. And so Futures Literacy Laboratories are, in effect, a mechanism, a tool that deploys collective intelligence, which is partly what we were trying to do with the examples in the chat, and the kind of sharing of word association. In other words, building up a context where people can move from tacit to explicit, from the images of the future that they don't always talk about, but yet they make them explicit, to create shared meaning in a group, and to also use the diversity of a group's images of the future, and in fact the lack of coherence or consistency in the specification of people's models for imagining the future, what we call the framing, to use that as a way to begin, not to create necessarily a consensus or homogeneity, but to create the conditions in which people can reflect upon the differences in the assumptions they're making. Because the future, since it's only imaginary, it's fiction, you must make assumptions, elementary assumptions, like the Earth will continue to turn around the sun, to orbit the sun, and more sophisticated ones, like the meaning of equality will change over time. And so when you're trying to elicit and cultivate these images of the future, it's very important to see where they're coming from, the myths, the narratives, the language, the constraints on people's conceptual framing of the future. And it's also important to get them to realize that they can become more practiced. In other words, they can develop what we call futures literacy. So all of that has been a kind of mixture of a variety of objectives. One is to do something that's relatively cost effective, meaning it's not too expensive to do. UNESCO is not a rich organization. It's also been a way to test this hypothesis that there are diverse reasons and methods for thinking about the future. People source their ideas of the future from many different places. It's also been a way of testing to show that, in a sense, people can come to feel more empowered with respect to their images of the future, and they can begin to see how important that empowerment is with respect to the hopes they feel and the motivations they have related to hope, but also fears and despair, the lack of futures which speak to them, and why those futures don't speak to them. Who has produced that future, and what it means. And I'll give you a little example. I ran a futures literacy lab in Rwanda now, must be about 3-4 years ago, with 120 students from the local university. And despite the obvious and I think quite seductive appeal of the Black Panther film, The City of Wakanda, which actually was what the students described when asked to talk about their desirable future in the first round. Once they kind of had given that image out as their way of thinking about the future initially, they said it made them feel kind of desperate and very pessimistic, because it didn't speak really to their experience, and they felt that it was very unlikely that they would reach that future. And I'm just using that as an example again to point out that as people begin to understand where their futures come from, so in some senses trying to decolonize some of their futures, and when they become able to articulate their futures, participation, the notion of participation changes. And so insofar as all of our projects and all of our policies are about the future, whether it's technology or socioeconomic or gender issues or whatever, they're all about the future. One of the key questions that I think is being posed in today's world is, how do we create the richness of the specificity, the differences that characterize different places? How do we take that into account? But how do we also ensure that participation is not just token and not just an exercise in trying to create legitimation, but actually a way of attaching infrastructure, long-term investments, major projects to the imagination and hopes and fears of the people who are actually going to be part of it. So, and I'll end on this point, is that it seems to me that as we make progress in what I'm calling the science of anticipation, or the discipline of anticipation, there's an opportunity here for people in the field, the development field, the World Bank, but other agencies and UN agencies, where we're working extensively with the High-Level Committee on Programs, which involves all 60 UN agencies, to find ways of introducing the future, not just through risk assessments, not just through well-laid plans that have milestones and outcomes and endpoints, but also by cultivating, and this is, I mean the word cultivating, the capacity of the relevant populations, the relevant users or local populations, to understand how their future, as they see it, is part of this process, and how also their idea of the future evolves. And I'll just give you, as a last point, the obvious example, which is investments in education, where people learn to read and write, where people learn about different subjects, changes them. They're never the same. Once you've learned to read, you're different. And that means your image of the future, your hopes and your fears will have changed. And one of the things that I think is crucial for policymaking, and particularly in the context of, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals or other goal-oriented efforts around the world, is that those goals obviously change as the world changes. And futures literacy and the introduction of the Futures Literacy Laboratories as a mechanism for cultivating and harvesting images of the future, I think really needs to become a key component of policymaking and of investment in all forms of capital: human capital, environmental capital, social capital, and obviously physical capital. So I'll stop there. I think maybe Eva, we wanted to offer a few case study or two, just to give people a very specific idea of what it means to run a Futures Literacy Lab. And I'll just say, a Futures Literacy Laboratory is one tool for basically developing and applying the anticipatory systems perspective on the future, rooted in history and context, rooted in capabilities, and also relatively easy to apply as a process which enriches both the policy side and the user side, or the constituencies, the stakeholders. But there are other mechanisms for doing that. Desk research, scenario exercises, etc. But it turns out that the Futures Literacy Laboratory, which is field tested now and has a design set of design principles, is I think quite an effective tool for bringing the future into policy making, investment decision making, investment let's call them pathways, in a quite efficient and powerful way. So with that, over to you, Eva.
Thanks a lot, Riel. And I'm also bouncing on a series of items that you mentioned, talking about obviously some of the desires that people have. We feel like we already have the response within us. And so we just apply that to different mechanisms. So I actually started the session by talking about futures that we knew, talking about probable futures, because usually when you get to think about the future, that's the first future that you actually respond to, and that's usually the future that you're going to respond to. Some of the assumptions that are behind future literacy as a capability is the role that the future plays in our present decision making, so in the decision making in the present. And it's obviously something that we usually play with as part of the Futures Literacy Lab. So I saw a question in the chat, just like, what exactly is the methodology? How do we do it? And who have we done it before? I'll mention maybe two things just before walking you through the methodology. The first element is the fact that as UNESCO, we've been working together with a series of sister UN entities, 32, actually at this stage. I do see a few around the room, such as UNDPPA. We have been involved with UNDP as well, ILO, most UN agencies that have developed foresight units or futures units, or are actually diving into that direction, have actually joined this small community of UN foresight and futures practitioners. And what UNESCO has been doing is also supporting all of those different exercises and, for example, running them through Futures Literacy Labs. And so those different Futures Literacy Labs that we've run about 100, just talking about UNESCO, not talking about all of our partners that are part of the UNESCO's Global Future Literacy Network. We've run over 100 Future Literacy Labs on themes of various kinds. Some were on land inequalities, other were on innovation ecosystems. What it means, the future of technology was also an aspect that was run, for example, for Saudi Arabia, since Riel was talking about students last week. And actually, that is something that can be done with banks or with students, can be done with a particular focus. We have a series of projects, for example, on the future of women in Sierra Leone. So it really depends on what you want to do with it. And the reason for that is basically because the objective of Future Literacy Lab is to walk people through the futures that they know, have them work collectively on futures that they don't know very much about, but doing it collectively in order for them to actually unearth what we call anticipatory assumptions. And I'll mention, of course, I'll explain what that is in a minute. Once they've actually explored different kind of futures, the main question that we have, and that's the question that will remain with all of us around this room, is what do we do of the future? Because obviously the future is not now and the future was not before. So what type of information can we get from the exercise that we're doing? What can we get from those different type of time travels in order to inform our practice? Can we better understand what the present is about and maybe some unintended consequences that we could not maybe have anticipated or have imagined because we're not necessarily using the right mindset or the right tools or the right approach to the future and the decision that we make in order to get there. And then starting from those new questions, from this new learnings, are there things that actually we can bring with us in the present and in this near future to actually think about new actions? What I've just described now is actually the 4 phases of the Futures Literacy Lab. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4. Phase 1 is basically a stage of revelation. It's about talking about the future that we know, probable futures, preferred futures of a particular topic, a particular theme of interest. We started the session talking about probable future of economic prosperity and development. It could have been another topic. We've run others, as I was telling you, on technology. There was some on the consequences of slavery. So you see that they all have their also different approach. The one on the consequences of slavery, or the future of the consequences of slavery, was actually to rethink the strategy of a group that was dedicated to issues that are related to the slave route project. The point was, when we have a topic that we care about, there's already answers that come by. You'll see, for example, that when we talked about economic prosperity and development, because we had mentioned elements around technology, there was elements that were coming again, accessibility, around inclusion, around the role of technology and how people can have access to the tools themselves. But sometimes we don't always question why we want to actually go for those tools to begin with. So we have this idea that technology should be spread out, but we don't actually know what we're spreading at. We know that we're spreading tools, but what exactly do people get out of it? So the objective of this phase 1, when we actually talk about probable future and preferred futures of a particular theme, diving using also different tools that are part of the futures community that we can mention, of course, during the Q&A session. We can also walk you through other futures tool, but it's not really about the tool itself. It's actually about getting people to talk about probable futures, preferred futures, because you realize that we don't get to talk about that to begin with. But what comes out of it is what we call anticipatory assumption. And I'll give you an example that I like to give because it's usually very easy to understand. We had done a lab on the future of cultural identity in Australia in 2015. So because the lab was run in 2015, the time span that we had was 2030. So what are the future of culture and identity in 2030 in Australia? Participants talked about how their probable future of culture actually speaks to them as being a moment in time in 2030 when there is less employment. So we asked the person why. Why do you believe that there's less employment in 2030 than before? And they say, well, we've seen how tuition fees have increased. And so we believe that less people would actually be able to afford going to university. And because of that, there's less jobs. And there's less jobs. So what we hear right away is a connection that people make between going to university and getting a job. So this idea that university is preparing you to enter the job market. Now, this assumption could be right, could be wrong. We're not in 2030 to tell them, even though we're closer to 2030 now than they were in 2015. So maybe you already have assumptions that you can share with them. But what was interesting about pointing the existence of this anticipatory assumption is that you realize that some of the future scenarios that you develop and that are going to lead some of the decision that you make or actually based on assumptions that we do not question. So here, because we believe that the university is actually setting us for more employment and that less employment is actually a bad indicator, it's not a good performance indicator, we're going to target a series of public policies as well as daily actions. So talking also about individuals and the way they process their lives, they're actually going to say, well, you know, in order to not reach that 2030, here's a series of action that we should take. We should have more people attend university, so reduce down tuition fees, for example, or at an individual level, I should make sure that I go to the university in order to get a job afterwards. Now, if you design, maybe as part of those scenarios, because we're talking about a future that does not exist just yet, are there more to be talked about that is not part of the conversation? Now, the element that you could think about would be to say, well, maybe the university could play a different role. It could be about technology. Technology sharing could be about just a space of knowledge sharing. It could be just a moment in time where, thanks to automation, we don't actually need to have a job as a remunerated job, like employment, but maybe people work, but they don't get remunerated because there's basic income or any other possibilities. But you manage to expand the conversation because you reveal the existence of anticipatory assumptions. And that is very much important for public policy, just as much as it is at an individual level for decision making. Once we've actually unearthed those probable and preferred futures, the futures that are in the room, this is the job of some of us that are actually on that call, develop a reframing scenario. The idea is to propose a scenario that is neither probable nor preferable, because the idea is that by provoking people into thinking about a future that they don't know, a future that is not based on the same type of assumptions that are usually on the table. The example I just gave, I can give another example later that actually speaks to another thing that UN Women was doing around the informal economy and why it's so important to actually question our anticipatory assumptions. But in any case, talking about futures that we don't know and doing it collectively is actually one way to bring more participatory action, because then we're on an equal footing. We don't know. And it's not a situation where you get the expert in the room, the policymaker in the room, and then communities. And there's this asymmetry of information between those different actors. You actually get to a certain moment in point where people actually are on the same footing. They don't know what's going to happen in 2030. They don't know what's going to happen in 2050. They can start to talk. So when it comes to developing participatory approaches for your respective settings, maybe with students earlier, we mentioned them, with bankers, which was an activity that we ran actually just 2 years ago with the largest association of bankers in Europe. All of them were put on the same equal footing to think about the future of a particular topic that they all care about. That's the thing that they have in common. Once we've actually been through a framing scenario that is also playful and creative, you'll see there's many ways to actually make it quite fun, is how, of course, there's games that are involved. You can build sculptures. You can actually, I had last time, I think, interviews, people that were interviewing one another to actually describe that 2050. Just to say that it's really can be as creative as you will. But what happens there is that you get people to talk. You get people to actually engage in a dialogue and in conversation that is meaningful, not only to them in that specific moment in time, but also for strategy implementation. When it happens, that's actually around phase 3, when you have those new questions that emerge. You've just explored probable futures of, for example, economic prosperity and development, preferred futures of economic prosperity and development, reframed futures that you didn't know about of economic prosperity and development. What does it tell you about the way you imagine the present? Is there something to be learned from the future? And so from there, you get new questions. We had people, for example, that were actually doing the future of innovation ecosystems, or the future of a strong bioeconomy in Eastern Africa, that was run actually by the Commission, the East African Commission. And the question that they had was, well, what could be the future of a bioeconomy in Eastern Africa, considering that for now, there's no other bioeconomy strategy on the continent except for South Africa? What does it mean to develop something that is regional? And some of the questions that actually emerged was, okay, we feel like we have a key focus on technology and it's important, but that being said, maybe we're actually thinking we're maybe hiding behind technology? Or are we actually ready to not have a magic like a magic wand that is the technology, and actually think about the human creativity that is needed in order to inform this technology? What exactly does it mean, for example, to innovate cooking recipes? And so here you're not actually talking about innovating, about the pan or about the different cooking tool utensils that you're using. It's actually what makes it new. And so this question of what makes it new is something that changes the conversation from how do we bring more technology home, from actually saying, what do we actually create anew? And so expanding the notion of creation and the notion of innovation right from the start. After that, we actually propose, depending on the settings, because once again, Future Literacy Labs can run for, we've done some together, like in the virtual setting over the span of 3 days, 3 hours per day, sometimes 4 days, 3 hours or 2 hours per day. It can also be 2 days in person, 1 day in person. So depending on the settings, we also have to adapt the duration of the phase, but also the amount of phases, because I'm mentioning 4, but we could do a lot more depending on what you want to do and what is actually the objectives, which is the reason behind the co-design that is needed to prepare for those activities. So here I focus on the workshop itself, but just so you know, there's things that need to happen beforehand and things that should be happening afterwards as well, in order to make it a concrete experiment for everyone who's actually in the room. So once you've actually talked about probable futures, preferred futures, you ask yourself new questions about the present. Then what can you do with it? The small group that you constituted over the span of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, are there things that you can actually do at your level that would actually speak to those new knowledges, to those new learnings that you acquired as part of the experiment that you run together? So this is the sequencing of a Future Literacy Lab. This is something that, is quite easy to do in a particular way, but also requires like time, energy, and efforts, but that is always quite rewarding. And it actually speaks to a series of design principles behind participatory action research. What does it mean for people to actually be all researchers around the table? And I'll just end on one experiment that was run actually in Togo, and speaks to this notion of mixing public policy with youth involvement. That experiment was actually done as part of a series of conversations that have been happening in Western Africa. I don't know if some of you know that we're expected to change currency it was supposed to actually start 2 years ago, but we're getting there. So there was this idea of moving from the CFA franc, which is the currency that we use in 14 countries in West Africa and Central Africa, to a currency that is called the ECO. As part of this conversation, we're like looking at examples. What is happening around the world? What does it mean to have a regional currency? Now, the most well-known example that we have in the world is the euro. And so since the CFA franc is actually pegged to the euro and is also very much associated with the European Central Bank, there was also this idea of connecting some of the things that already exist in that scene and adapting that to what would be happening on the continent. Now, what we are actually finding from just the colloquium that preceded those questions, so before we ran a Future Literacy Lab, was how we were just replicating a model onto another. So we felt like if we were going to go for the future of the CFA franc, we're just continuing this reproduction. So we try to take a step back, and that was part of the co-design. Like, what do we want to achieve? If we want to renew those conversations, then there might be a step back that we need to take. So we decided to go for a topic, which was the future of value. And I won't run you through the different phases, but just so you know, we talked about probable futures of value, preferred futures of value, and then we proposed a reframing scenario that had nothing to do with what they had proposed before. And what's interesting about value is that in the context of the African continent, most particularly, and that's also related to obviously the colonial history, when we talk about value, there's economic value, but there's also social values. And this question that there's a dissociation between the way people consume and the way people are. So what does it mean? Who I am as a person and who am I as a consumer is not necessarily the same answer that you're actually giving. And so the question is it normal to be distinct as a consumer for the person that you are in your family setting, in the way you interact with people in the street? And so as we were trying to connect that in our probable and preferred futures, we got to find out that one of the final questions that people wanted to ask is that they were not so interested in the Industrial Revolution in terms of having more manufactured goods. That is something that they could be diving into, but they were interested in knowing, how do we valorize an economy that is already happening? And for them, the economy that was already there on the ground was what they call a making economy or fixing economy. This idea that whatever you have, there's always this type of recycling element. But here I'm not talking about recycling from a green perspective. It can be, but it's not like the thing that is happening on the ground is really this idea that suddenly you have a wheel that can be transformed into a tire, that can be transformed into a necklace, that can be transformed into something that would be helpful in order to fry plantains or other vegetables. And so what was interesting as part of this process is two things. Well, there's many more, but I'll name two. The first one is around the co-design and how identifying how we were replicating models right during the colloquium that preceded the Futures Literacy Lab was one way to actually target the issue differently. So not talk about the future of a specific currency, but actually understand that there was something at stake around this dissociation between the consumer and the person. And the second thing is how the cyber processes that were done with young people, because here that was not a discussion that was led by economists. It was actually a discussion that was led by young people who were based in Lomé, which is the capital city of Togo. Just having those young people here in the room and discuss those issues and realizing that they were already doing things and they wanted to be part of those conversations, we felt like, yes, there's a connection to be made between the economists who were part of this colloquium and the young people were taking part in this participatory process. And so this invitation was actually to have this kind of back and forth between two constituencies who would benefit from talking to one another. And we see as organizations, we try because it's also part of the UN Agenda 2030 to actually bring more citizens to be part of the conversations, to bring more people, you know, for example, at UNESCO, we have a gender party, we have a youth party, we have an Africa party. And so we're trying to see how can we bring more people so that we don't leave no one behind. And one way to do that is actually to get to hear from what they have to say. And using those type of creative participatory approaches is actually one of the greatest way for us to actually bring them to that conversation without losing meaning, because we can then reuse that in the way we actually set our strategies, the way we develop our policies. So I thank you for listening to what I had to say, and then allow me to give the mic over and back to Stella. And I'm looking at your questions that I just received in the chat and couldn't read at the same time.
Thank you so much, Riel and Eva. We have some questions. Eva, if you are able to see them, I think they relate to what you've been sharing with us.
I'm more happy to do so. I'm also conscious of people having heard my voice over and over. So Riel, if you also want to go ahead. I see questions on diversity, creativity, but there's also a question on who gets mixed in the different groups. And so on that question very quickly, I can just mention, since it was actually my last point, yes, we can actually mix groups. There's advantages and disadvantages to mixing groups. And of course, I will not hide like those issues. Basically, when you have a homogeneous group, it allows you to build strategy more easily, because then the analytical work that you need to do afterwards is lessened, because people all care about the same thing and they know how it's done within their own organization. Now, by bringing other people into the conversation, obviously you do get new perspectives, an external eye that is actually of interest, but it means that you do need to do the analytical work as to what type of information am I actually retrieving from this, because then you need to connect the ideas that were proposed to the room to the things that actually are done by the organization. We've done both, and I have to say that both are pretty effective, but it's a matter of co-design. It's a matter of basically managing expectations. So it needs to be put on the table right from the start. Are we trying to just make sure that we have some more capacity building within our organization And so if that's the case, then we stick to just being amongst ourselves, or are we actually seeking to get to hear things that we haven't heard before? Over to you, Riel.
Thank you. I want to stress that the design of the labs is actually very dependent on context, because you know it might seem obvious, but the future is is kind of like used with caution in a way. It's really it's really it's a powerful force. It motivates people. People get enthusiastic. People react to it. They have feelings. They have fears. They have values that they associate with it. And for the most part, using when we invite people to talk about the future, in many cases, almost nobody's ever invited them to talk about the future in this kind of way. And it feels like a moment of privilege, but also a moment that can be intimidating. And since it's often also something that astrologers and econometricians are given responsibility for, and politicians, people feel that it's not their business. And so, in order to create the atmosphere and the context in which people are ready to share and dig into their own, often unarticulated assumptions and hopes and fears, you really need to design and co-design very carefully. When we did a lab, a Futures Literacy Lab in Freetown in Sierra Leone, we co-designed it with the participants, and the result of the co-design was that we started with a libation, and we started with song and dance, and a tribute to the ancestors, because that opened up and gave permission to explore the topic, which was the transition from being a young person to being an adult in the context of Sierra Leone. We didn't do that when we ran it in Ulaanbaatar, and we're thinking about the future of Mongolia at the university. The co-design led to a different way of starting and running the Futures Literacy Lab in order to encourage people. But in that case, we did build sculptures. And I can tell you that 3 out of the 5 sculptures that were built during the reframing phase, symbolic representation of people's futures, had yurts in them. So not that surprising, but it gave people an opportunity to express the significance of a yurt in the way that their imagination functions. I'll give one last example. When we co-designed a process for the Prime Minister's office in Ireland, and it was a 2-year futures literacy exercise, the very first lab, the very first phase that Eva was describing, the phases, the very first phase of what was actually a set of labs that we ran over a period of time. The very first phase was run in the stadium in Dublin, where in the 20s there had been a massacre, and which had very deep symbolic significance for all of the participants, so that we didn't even have to say, when people came to participate in the event, this is about the future of Ireland. They understood that this was about Ireland just by the very fact that it was taking place in a symbolic location. In other words, Futures Literacy Labs take into account the way in which people integrate myths, the metaphors, the narrative structure, beginning, middle, and end, the importance of theatricality, the expectation that so many of us have, that Act 1 is the introduction to the characters, Act 2 is kind of the intrigue and the exploration, the detective finding the clues, and Act 3 is the denouement and the conclusion and some sort of sense of resolution and satisfaction. So all of these design factors are taken into account in the co-design, meaning in the work that takes place between the people who have experience with the design principles and the local champion, who is, which could be a policy group, which could be an investment team, which could be a set group of engineers. 3 weeks ago, we ran a Futures Literacy Lab with 35 engineers from the French train company SNCF, mid-level engineers, managers, about the future of mobility. The future enters into just about everything. And because everybody uses anticipation, a baby anticipates. Anticipation is so universal. You can find ways to invite people to begin to explore their anticipatory assumptions, to explore the way in which images of the future play a role in what they see, perception, and what they do, choices, and also to begin to see that the future is not just about choice. It's deeply about perception, powerfully about perception. What we see, what we can sense and make sense of, what we can invent, and where we feel that there's an inadequacy of today's dictionary to describe the present, which is how tomorrow's dictionary gets created, that inventive process is something that is very strongly structured and influenced by the images of the future that are in our heads. So that, I hope that kind of gives you some sense of the background here.
Riel, we have a question from Rachel. If you think COVID has changed the way we think about future thinking, but also in describing how you are engaging in running these future labs, it's a lot about human contact, yeah? So cultural, anthropological, human kind of interaction are important in designing these exercises. Now that COVID kicked in and we've been using Zoom a lot, has it made these future literacy labs exercises more difficult?
It's a great question, and it gives me a chance to talk to innovation and crisis. So, you know, the last decade or so has been a very innovation kind of hype. Now everybody wants to innovate. But to me, that's symptomatic of something which has to do with, we could call it transitional or the decline of existing or accepted solutions, and the fact that we have to improve them. And therefore, people are looking for difference. Innovation is a form of difference. COVID was a form of difference. Before the confinement, and there was one world, and then it's different afterwards. All of these activities, innovation, dealing with crisis, are in effect testing or exercising the human capacity to make sense of change, to be able to invent and pursue change. And the proposition here is a very simple one. Our images of the future are in fact the metric, the lens through which we categorize and actually address change. Because, you know, change is relative to what existed before and what we expect will exist in the future. And so I've found that the period of innovation, you know, interest in innovation was very open to futures thinking, because the futures thinking was helpful in the creative process of innovation. But the pandemic has been even better, because the pandemic demonstrated in a brutal fashion that we depend on our images of the future to understand the world around us. And this is a profound and important point, which relates to investment projects, which relates to policy, which relates to people's relationships with investments and policy, because it's the way they perceive the world, the way they construct their motivation and their hopes. So, you know, I think that it's not, you know, it's not because it's a great idea. It's because the current time historically, and here I mean the pandemic, but also climate extinction, also the innovation wave, which reflects the declining legitimacy and efficiency of existing institutions, all of that invites us to be more attentive to difference, more capable of understanding change, and therefore we need to become more futures literate.
Thank you, colleagues. If anyone would like to come in and ask your question, please raise your hand.
Stella, is it okay if I come in briefly? Yes, thanks for these really, really nice presentations. I'm Stela and at the IMF, and I work in a unit that uses foresight tools. I think that one of the most powerful aspects of this for our institutions, for MDBs as well as IFIs, is probably getting all the stakeholders in the room, especially because we tend to be quite siloed and maybe potentially avoidant of hearing all stakeholders' views of us. And I was wondering, for like, how do you manage that live? If we were to craft some kind of future literacy lab where we really did bring in CSOs, where we brought in local communities, and they were quite critical of us, not only in the past, but they brought those forward into the future. How do you create an atmosphere where everybody still feels like it's productive to share?
Riel, and following up on Sandile's question, I think Klaus also had a similar question in terms of scale. How do you scale this kind of engagement? Yeah, in addition to the complexity of stakeholders you have to bring in, but also us working with client countries, diverse client countries. How do we scale this approach? Over to you.
Thank you. Look, let me start with the second question first, Sandile, because the issue here is in a sense, the term futures literacy is not by accident. And we're dealing with a situation, as I said, where many people have not been invited to think about the future very much. And so you're inviting them into a process where they feel, to a certain extent, disempowered, and where the issues of how to design a process that uncovers and excavates, but also creates people's anticipatory systems is something that's quite unfamiliar. So we're just at the beginning, in a sense, of really paying attention to this capacity and understanding really where it's located in the different cultures and the different contexts. So it's located in a different place with policymakers, and you can have a different entry point for the policymakers, and then you need to do it differently if you're doing it in a village like we were doing in Sierra Leone. We worked in a small village of 3,000 people, Dankawali, where the governance and the cultural context were totally different from if we were doing this at the ministry and the research council in Norway, which is where I was 2 weeks ago. And in that sense, it can't scale from the design implementation perspective, but from the design principles perspective, it can definitely scale. And there we're seeing that there are some significant and pretty robust design principles related to collective intelligence, related to learning voyages, and related to understanding anticipatory systems. And I don't want to get too technical here, but we've been trying to create a framework which allows us to understand different anticipatory systems and processes, and therefore be able to structure the process in such a way that we take into account those different points of departure. So Stella, you are absolutely right, is that how do we become sensitive to the anthropological, ethnographic, historical, colonial, decolonial? It's by understanding those principles and applying them with the local champion. And here's the crucial ingredient that deals a lot with the political question. If you don't have a local champion who can select the participants, then I don't use, for me, the term laboratory is literal. In a laboratory, if you want to do, biological experiments, I don't know, on frogs, well, you need to have some frogs in the lab to do your experiments. In the case of running something about the imagination that people in a small village in Sierra Leone have about their future and what their relationship is to the forest, to electricity, and education, well, if you do that in New York, you're not going to get anything for the people of Dankawali. You need to do it in Dankawali with the people there. And so the co-design really is the critical requirement for ensuring that the people who are invited are going to come to the process with a willingness to engage, and to engage with something that, like I said, is it's not, the future is not just anything. It's the future of your children. It's the future of the planet. It's the future. People feel it, and so the emotive, and that's why also the design needs to take into account the theatricality, the narrative, the myths. Who invites, how they invite. The other day we ran, I'll leave it nameless, with an international multilateral organization. We ran a lab, and the CEO of the organization decided to be part of the lab. Well, it caused a lot of design difficulties because the CEO was present when people wanted to talk about things they're not that confident about. So all of these things are really crucial for the design. And we haven't gone into the issue of facilitation, which, you know, as everybody knows here in the room, I'm sure that you know, facilitation is a skill and you can be a professional facilitator and you will understand the group dynamics, the psychology. In the case of Ireland, we went to the people who were professional facilitators from Ireland, not professional facilitators from somewhere else, people who knew the local reference points, who understood the local Irish rules football, etc. So these are all really crucial parts of a careful design. And in that sense, it's not scalable. But on the other hand, and let me just point this out because I think it's really crucial, by doing it, you actually plant the capacity to do it locally. The processes we're using are open source. The processes we're using are not mysterious or difficult. And in fact, it's like with reading and writing. If you have a group of people who begin to learn to read and write, they begin to tell others in the community, hey, I learned to read and write. You can learn to read and write too. Here's how you can do it. And the whole point, in some sense, is not at a time when we're supposed to talk about viruses in a positive way, but there's a viral component to futures literacy, which is that the community itself begins to become more aware of where their ideas of the future come from, how those ideas shape perception and choice, and they become more empowered with respect to their own imagination, and then they don't need the designers and the facilitators. They can do it themselves.
Thank you, Riel. I think Benedictor has a question. Benedictor, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I have one observation and one question, if I may, Stella. First of all, I couldn't agree more. I see futures literacy as an exercise in liberation. So in freedom, you ask yourself, where do my imaginations come from? You deconstruct them by talking about them, by interchanging them with other people. Through collective wisdom, you see them differently, and then you rebuild your imagination in a more complex way, interchanged with others. And I think this is really a crucial capacity that we have to develop over time, because it differentiates us from ourselves, but it also integrates us with others. And this is the basic exercise, I think. My question, and perhaps it is a superfluous question because I already know what Riel will answer, but the question is this. I'm currently involved in a transformation process in Africa, which is extremely dangerous and critical, as many processes are on different levels in different parts of the world. But at the moment, I'm a little bit involved in a transformation process in Guinea, where people seek to rebuild their constitution and to come closer to democracy, unfortunately by the means of a coup. And this is just one example that leads me to my question, and it is not dissimilar to the question about COVID. Is future literacy more successful when there are processes of deep change, of unrest, of renewal? So historic transition phases or passages of change that further than the openness towards a process of deconstructing yourself and rebuilding your inner self? Or is it better to rely on stable conditions, on developed conditions, so people have more time and are more easy going in thinking about futures, not under the imminent pressure of change? Perhaps this is a very stupid question, Riel, but it just is of interest because the current global environment is so differentiated between urgencies in one area and the neighbors are thriving, so that I think this is a crucial aspect also for the World Bank, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an important issue, and I don't think that there's a, like you say, one answer in one place. But let me just very briefly say that I don't consider, and this is debatable, of course, I don't consider continuity so the idea of permanency, durability, as inherently necessary for people to feel confident. Because there is an argument which says stability and continuity and equilibrium, etc., are necessary conditions for feeling secure. I think that there's a capability related issue here. If you go into the city from the countryside and you can't read, you're going to be frightened because you can't read the street signs, and you're going to be worried. But if you can read the signs, you're going to feel to a certain extent empowered. Wow, this is a new place and I can find my way around. And so I think that the capability that we're talking about here is really fundamental to our times. In a similar way that I think the transition from peasant societies, rural to industrial urban societies, was functionally assisted, not by design, but by, experimentation and by evolutionary processes, by the universalization of reading and writing. I think in a similar fashion, the ability for us to appreciate diversity, which I think is a necessity in the current context, and to be able to use difference to pursue diversification approaches to resilience, which I also think is essential from a strategic perspective, will depend on developing futures literacy. So I think that and I'll put it in these terms. If you want to improvise, you have to do a lot of practicing first, and you have to develop your capabilities. And so planning to become a musician, a dancer, doing the exercises, understanding your instrument, understanding your body, and music and movement and expression are crucial preparations for improvisation. And that improvisation then becomes very reinforcing and powerful, but only on the basis of that preparation. And I think that this is really what we're dealing with here. You can't have an instant change. We're talking about generational change. We're talking about something that changes the conditions of change. So it is an important issue, and there are people who think that continuity is the only way. But if continuity is the only way to create security, we're in big trouble because our universe is not into it. And so we better become better, I think, at dealing with change, because it's the only certainty.
Allow me to just also beef on what you're saying, because I also heard two questions in Roland's question earlier. There's this question of for whom is futures literacy? So actually this I was hearing the question, is this the capability that is being developed in settings that are actually open to change and open to innovation? And so there's other settings that might not be so open to that. And so if that is the case, is future literacy for them as well? And then I also hear a question around the notion of urgency and how the urgency of the present can actually prevent us from thinking about the future. I'll start actually with the latter before addressing the former, because those two are connected. When it comes to the urgency of the present versus thinking about the future, what we've noticed, and actually there's a series of literature around that, around how we're not all equal when it comes to the future. We don't all get the same opportunities in the future to begin with, but also there's this idea that thinking about the future is a luxury for many of us around the planet. And actually what the COVID pandemic actually allowed for many people to think about is that we're all suddenly put in a situation of life and death for many of us. And it doesn't mean that we all died, but this idea of being reminded of our mortality and how, the present is so urgent is something that touched not only people living in what we call the global south, but also people living in the global north. And so there was this idea that, in fact, well, the future is one thing, thinking about 2040, 2050 is important, but let's think about what's going on in 2021, just this month. Now, what we realize is that, yes, the present is always urgent because it concerns who we are. If we don't have a present, then how can we actually afford having a future to begin with? But what we notice is also the series of path dependency that Riel was just mentioning earlier, is because we think about the urgency of the present so much that there's a series of decisions that we make in the present that are not very much future oriented. And because of that, future generations actually have to suffer from those quick decisions that we make. Now, what we also noticed is that I was talking about the pandemic earlier, and what we see is that many countries had similar reactions that actually speaks to this path dependency, this idea that there's a solution that was found in order to prevent people from engaging into more social interactions in order to prevent the further contamination. And what we noticed is that even though those solutions, such as, for example, confinement, were not adequate for all countries around the world, we felt like we could not afford going for a solution that was otherwise, because then we would actually suffer from the consequences and people actually judging us for adopting a solution that was not mainstream or was not dominant. Now, what we see is that when we implement future literacy labs in different settings, and we talked again and again about co-design, but it's also because it's so important. What we notice is that people actually understand, for a variety of different reasons, what we're doing. Some of them will see the value in engaging into more creative exercise or participatory exercise where they get their CEO together with the intern. That could be, one reason to actually join those type of experiments. But others see the value in actually connecting other ways of knowing. And so what we see is that when we talk about, earlier when I talked about the future of value, it was done as part of the exercise. We use music because it was relevant to that particular setting. But what we see is that people were actually able to dive into conversations because it looked like things that they had done before within their community. In many African countries, for example, we have what we call community conversations. And so the project that Riel was talking about, which is one that we're implementing in Sierra Leone on the future of women in Sierra Leone, that has different settings that involve university levels or research capacities, that also involves a local community engagement, and at a policy level engages the Ministry of Gender and Children's Affairs in Sierra Leone. So you have different constituencies that are actually involved in the process. But this process is actually very much similar to something that people know around gathering people from the same community to talk about something that they care about. And what you get to realize that the future is used as an excuse for people to talk about things that matters to them. Same way when we run labs, I haven't had over the last 2 years. Before those 2 years, I didn't have as many scenarios of pandemic or how to deal with the consequences of a pandemic. I did have pandemic before sometimes, but it was quite occasional. And now we see that, it's something that is prevailing in people's minds. So when you think about 2050 or 2060, they think about a new pandemic, or they think about dealing with the consequences of the pandemic that we are currently suffering from. So there's really this idea that when you talk about the future, you allow for people to talk about something that they care about. And that is not a privilege that we would like to leave to people that are very much innovation driven or change driven. Because what we get to see is also that those that are labeled as being, change driven or might not necessarily be those that are the most open to change as being a way to question the way they think about difference, to question the relation that they make between some assumptions that they do not question and their perception of the present. So what we're doing as part of those exercises is actually something that is accessible to all. That being said, it's also important to set your parameters right from the start, hence the importance of co-design. I remember, for example, this lab that we did with bankers where during the co-design, they said, well, we don't want to talk about degrowth. We don't want to talk about any forms of lack of growth in that particular setting. That was a parameter that they set. On that basis, you organize a session that is actually going to be tailored to something that they requested. So that's just one example to say the limitations are not necessarily coming from those that we think to begin with, but also that regardless of the type of urgency that you have, we've run labs, for example, for Syrian refugees in their family settings. And those were amongst the most transformational experiences they actually describe afterwards. And there's actually a paper to that effect, but we can discuss it later. But just to say that nobody should be prevented from thinking about the future. And on the contrary, our role also as intergovernmental organizations is to remind everyone that they have a role to play in the future.
Thank you, Eva and Riel. I think we are almost ready in terms of the timing, but a question that we've been discussing earlier with you and Sandile, how can we continue this conversation? We have many participants from who joined today are from multilateral organizations. How would it be possible to organize a future literacy lab around the work that multilaterals are doing in and development? Again, COVID is still here, hasn't left. This uncertainty, this urgency to adapt is with us, and it's going to stay with us. Do you have any thoughts about how we might continue the dialogue and the collaboration?
I think that that's a very important issue, and I think what I would see is taking a very opportunistic approach, meaning that there are projects underway all around the world, and this is essentially what we've been doing, whether it's with UN disaster risk reduction or FAO or whatever, is that when the future comes up as something that people want to address more effectively, that they have a certain they may want to do scenarios, they may want to do foresight and strategic planning, they may want to do something that integrates the future into what they're doing. The futures literacy anticipatory systems approach helps to do that. And let me just relate the again from my own story. You know, I was very unhappy in 1988 when I had to design this big process. I was the manager of policy and research, and they said, "This is your job, the future of the post-secondary." And I said, "Why am I using a hammer? Is it just because it's the only tool I've got? Maybe I should be using a screwdriver, but I don't happen to have one. I don't know how to use it." And one of the key things here is that I think all of us are engaged in using the future and applying the future, but where we're, you know, I think at a bit of a loss is why am I using one tool as opposed to another in particular contexts? And that's where this community, the Futures Literacy community, and I appreciate the Futures Literacy Global Network that's part of the call as well, can play a role in helping to integrate in. It's not added on, it's really integrating it into something that's already happening. So if anybody wants to do a Futures Literacy Lab as part of their innovation process, as part of their water infrastructure exercise, as part of whatever it happens to be, COVID recovery, we're in a position to help bring a futures literacy anticipatory systems perspective to bear. And generally speaking, that's by doing futures literacy labs together, because it's just a good way to learn together and also to see how it works and the kind of impact that it has. It's a scientific process, it's an evidence-based process, it's a laboratory, and so that would be, to me, the way to for us to move forward, essentially by building up a community of practice, Stella. That's what we've been doing around the world with UN agencies and with a lot of other people. So, we're open to collaboration.
Riel, thank you. You mentioned earlier the smart mobility, the mobility future exercise in France, and we've been working with a bank team exploring future smart mobility, future mobility in LAC, in Latin American countries. So we might reach out to you and see if we can learn from each other. We are currently exploring digital climate futures for adaptation and mitigation in agriculture, transport, urban, and energy. So there are some efforts going on, and I'm sure we could probably process everything we've learned today and come back to you. I would like to ask Sandile to come in now. Sandile.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, this was a really powerful and inspiring discussion on futures literacy. Thank you very, very much, of course, to UNESCO and World Bank for co-designing this session. I think the benefits of the capabilities building aspect of this work really can't be understated. And that's for ourselves as individuals, as teams, as institutions, and of course, in the work with our member countries. I'd love to share this recording internally and maybe with some other MDBs as well that couldn't make it today. And then is there some way for us to maybe like have some kind of sign up where we can send that around and also say, if you're interested as individuals in our institutions and participating in a lab, that we can kind of aggregate those names somewhere?
Eva, I think, you know, we have the email list probably for this event, and certainly the Futures Literacy team at UNESCO is aggregating a lot of this. We're currently the kind of nexus, I guess. So, you know, the thing to do.
So we can just send names your way.
Encourage people to, yeah, to contact us. And I think obviously, you know, the specific projects will provide opportunities. I mean, and this is what we're doing around the world, is that, you know, people come in as fly on the wall, or they come in as, you know, facilitators in the peer facilitation breakout groups. There's lots of different ways for people to kind of get on board and begin to build up that capability, like I said, which is a train the trainer, open source approach. We're working on a playbook that would help people also to a certain extent, and you know, it's really, it is a let 1,000 flowers bloom, but it's also, let's try and build the network on a not on a, you know, an ex ante rationale, but on a, I need to do this, let's do it.
I like the low-hanging fruit approach, fully aligned. And thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandile. Thank you, Eva and Riel. Thank you, everyone who have joined. We will share the recording, and let's continue the discussion, and let's join efforts, learn from each other, and build the community. Wishing everyone happy holidays, and looking very much forward to reconnect in 2022.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
Be safe.
Looking forward.
Thank you so much, Stela, for running us through smoothly through the process. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Much appreciated. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.